by the end of the century. So I think that we have to recognise that, and the capacity for state action has to trump that. And there are a whole series of changes within the policy frameworks existing that need to change urgently in order to address climate change. And that goes for Europe, the US, and also in developing countries. The second point is that obviously TTIP is about us trading with the US trading with us. And coming back to Deputy Tobin's initial question around the impact on third countries, the analysis in full does not exist on what the potential direct impact will be as it relates to trade diversion. But we do know that it will have a negative impact on developing countries in terms of trade diversion, not a massive increase as some reports have predicted. But there's an obligation on the EU under the Lisbon Treaty to do a full analysis on policy coherence and how this will impact on third countries. That hasn't been done. There's been a very limited study which looks at labour standards, which has been done. What we can say from the existing ISDSs that exist already in the bilateral trade investment agreements is that if this system of TTIP, as predicted, would universalise this kind of trade agreement because it will cover 40% of world trade, the precedent that this sets in relation to the capacity of developing countries to produce their own food there's a very serious risk there, alongside the risk of climate change. 50% of food globally is produced by smallholders, and yet TTIP will place an unprecedented advantage into the hands of multinational corporations. They already have a very strong advantage globally within the world food system, and this will serve to only increase that monopoly that they have over the world food system. We think that this will have a further impact, not a direct impact on the food system, but on the capacity of the least developed countries to be able to bring in other public financial flows into their country. So it will be also the acceptance of a TTIP style of trade liberalisation will be further seen as a condition for aid, for other sources of finance, for other kinds of investment coming into the countries. It will have a spiral effect also in terms of the capacity of those third countries to set environmental and social standards. So I think that from our perspective in Trocaire, we see this as a very serious concern, and one that we're going to be doing further work on in the coming months and the coming year.
Thank you, Ms Gould. Senator Quinn, you wanted to come in again?
There were just two points. One of them is in connection to Barry Finnegan's point about the cosmetics and the ban on cosmetics in Europe. I actually don't know anything about cosmetics, but I do remember 30, 40 years ago when Europe allowed thalidomide. But one person in America, and she was in charge of the health, she says, no, I'm not convinced that we should allow this particular drug. And Europe had a huge case of children suffering from thalidomide for many, many years. America didn't have one case because they didn't allow it. So we want to be careful not to just take individual cases on that basis. I think it does depend on a control, and I think I would certainly argue that let's encourage TTIP, but on the basis that we can control it, we can watch it, we can influence it, and I think that's what we're doing here to a certain extent today. Just one other point in regard to the whole question of genetically modified foods or whatever they were. Way back again, I'm talking about old days, in 1970, Norman Borlaug won the Nobel Prize because he discovered an ability to put a new strain of wheat production that saved millions of lives. And that was he was Norwegian, I think. And yet, these are the sort of things we should be encouraging rather than saying, oh no, let's dampen it down, let's not have these changes. I believe we've great opportunities in our hands. Let's make sure we use them.
Thank you. Senator Quinn, Deputy Tobin.
I think the first point that Senator Quinn makes is good in that the fact that there were two different standards and two different regulations within Europe and the States meant that, at least in the States, there was a capture of the threat to thalidomide. I think what the problem is that there won't be those two different standards and there won't be those two different regulatory, so there won't be the two chances to capture the problem. I think Volkswagen is probably an example of where, because there was two standards, at least the Americans found that there were efforts by Volkswagen to hide the level of emissions from their vehicles, etc. The issue of regulatory balance is important, because there needs to be balance. There's no doubt about it. But right now we have some democratic oversight of that regulatory balance. If we cede that to the ISDS, we no longer have that direct control over it. And the other issue is that we do have a functioning judicial system in Europe. We have a very strong, powerful, useful one, which is, has democratic oversight, which is very important, but two, is highly respected internationally. And I've had, let's say, conversations with people representing the American government's view, and they have admitted that they think it's a very good judicial system. I think one of the points that they will get across is, if they give us a opt-out in Europe with regards to this, therefore how would they go to an emerging country which may not have just as strong history with regards to jurisprudence and demand it from them, etc. But the fact of the matter is, our judicial infrastructure is adequate for companies and individuals to defend and represent themselves with it. Just there's two other points. I think the climate change issue is a massive change, and there's a leaked document that indicated that the European Commission had told its negotiators that, in actual fact, if climate change issues came for discussion that militated against freeing up of trades, that they were to obviously put the pressure on the latter issue rather than the former issue there. Just with your views on that, and then talk to us about, this is a living agreement, in my understanding. So how, so even if there is a particular, if people sign up to an agreement at the moment, this agreement then has the ability to evolve in the future. Maybe if you can talk to us about that as well.
Thank you. Would you like to come in first?
Just 2 points. One is that, in a way, one of the alarming things about this, as far as democracy is concerned, is how all of these negotiations, to a great extent, are being done behind closed doors. It's extraordinarily difficult to get any information about it, and we only know as much as we do because some of the people who are actually involved in the negotiations actually leaked some of the documents. They were so spooked by some of the things that were being actually, in fact, proposed, and that's one of the reasons why we know what we do know at this stage. So just make that point on that. But also, just in case there's any misunderstanding, it's not just in Europe that there is this concern around TTIP in its present form. There's enormous concern in America as well. And I know a friend of mine, Alice Waters, whose name may be familiar to some of you, who runs Shape Beneath the Bird in California. She represents and would be a voice of, as well as many other people, the people who are concerned about what Barry was referring to as high quality food that nourishes and is wholesome and healthy for the population. And they were already enormously concerned about the dumbing down of regulations around food in the US and food products, not to speak of with TTIP. So there are huge concerns, and many people lobbying from the US and with concerns about TTIP. So it's not just Europe versus the US in this case. There are many people who have similar concerns right across the.
Okay, Mr. Bradley.
Just very briefly on one point, Deputy. You mentioned the fact that, look, we have a functioning judicial system, and you're absolutely right. If you look at the history of how ISDS came about, it was because there was this concern among investors that they would be going into countries which did not have a functioning judicial system, and that there would be the politicisation almost of the judicial system there, and that's how ISDS came about. But what we have here is the European Union and the United States, two places that have a functioning, operating judicial system, and there's no problem on that. The issue now is that you have countries who are actively looking to get rid of ISDS from existing trade agreements. South Africa is one, which has looked at bilateral investment treaties that they have with Germany and other European countries, and actually actively looking to get rid of the ISDS clause within those agreements. So there is a realisation amongst countries, not only in Africa but also in South America as well, that ISDS, it's not really worth butting it into trade agreements, and ultimately a trade agreement can happen without ISDS anyway. Australia, for example, has decided that in the pursuit of their trade agreements, if they can, they're not going to put ISDS in. So it can be done, and we would argue that it can be done here as well.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Ms. Gold?
Yeah, just on the issue of climate change, yes, there was that leaked document which came out in the middle of the Paris negotiations, which I was at, and it certainly created an atmosphere of suspicion within civil society, but I think also on the part of other countries who were not party to who were unaware of the way that the EU was planning to negotiate on that issue. I think that TTIP, it brings us back to the question, TTIP is predicated on an economic model which relies on fossil fuels being used at current and increasing rates, marginally, but increasing rates towards the middle of the century. We don't trade with the US in renewable energy, but we do trade in oil and other fossil fuels. And I think it's predicated on a model of ever-increasing consumption and production, which we know has to be addressed if we're going to address climate change. So it does not factor in the reality of climate change into the agreement. There's been no debate, open debate on this issue of how this particular model relates to the issue of climate change. There's a very interesting study that's just come out by the International Institute of Environment and Development, which puts figures on the costs, the carbon costs of a projected TTIP. Unfortunately, I don't have them at this particular moment, but it basically says that the costs will be very high in terms of the lock-in that the TTIP will ensure towards the middle of the century in terms of fossil fuels. So, and I think that the effect that then it will have on third countries, like the developing countries, in terms of their lack of capacity to tackle the kind of measures that need to be taken to mitigate against climate change, it is very serious. If you look at President Obama's move to stop the building of the Keystone XL pipeline, specifically as the first major infrastructure cancellation on the grounds of climate change, and the fact that the American government is now being sued for $15 billion by TransCanada for that. If you can only imagine a small developing country that wants to take similar measures on a much smaller scale in order to address climate change mitigation, they will not have the capacity to challenge these kind of companies. In fact, the turnover of these companies often far exceeds the entire budget of countries for a year. So I think there's an imbalance there which TTIP does not take into account. So on a climate change basis, it really is a serious concern.
Mr. Finnegan?
Yeah, I'd love to think that we could give it a go and see how it pans out and control TTIP. But the entire objective is to not be able to control it afterwards. Because what we're going to do is we're going to create a super court that doesn't have to abide by EU law or American law or the judgments of the European Court of Justice or the judgment of the European Court of Justice. Any company that has a problem with any law or regulation will be able to sue the government directly in this private arbitration behind closed doors, where the so-called judges, it's in their interest, the longer the case lasts, the more they get paid. And there is no mechanism whatsoever to control TTIP once it gets out. And that's why 3.2 million people across Europe have signed a petition against it. That's why Darina and Eoin and Lorna and myself are here. It's why 250,000 people in Berlin protested. There hasn't been a protest that size in Germany in over a generation. And I think our concerns are justified. Even if you just go with the released documents of the European Commission, it's quite clear what the objectives are. I'd love to think, Deputy Lawler, that our young people have a future using information technology and computers and learning how to use it. I would love to see that. I would love to see the continuation of a genuinely open and free market on the internet. TTIP doesn't have that plan. When you get a young lad who has a bright idea for a new website and he gets a bit of money in it and he starts making a few up, why is he able to have a website? Why doesn't the phone company charge him €50,000 a year so that his website goes down the phone line into your computer? The reason the phone companies don't charge the young lad for having a website to go down their phone line that they own is because that's illegal. We've got laws in Europe and America called net neutrality. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind that AT&T, Verizon, Vodafone and the rest of the internet service providers are very clear that it's immoral for the government to force them to treat every website in the world the same. They want to be able to charge people so that your website goes down the phone line into people's computers. Net neutrality can easily be seen as what the corporate lawyers call an unnecessarily restrictive barrier to trade, an unnecessarily and overly meddlesome barrier to trade, opposing the least meddlesome regulations. And that's the purpose of TTIP, is to stop small companies starting new websites and to maintain this, what they call oligopoly, with a handful of huge corporations controlling it. Just very last word then on the environment. Spain, the Spanish government is very concerned about climate change. The whole south of Spain is turned into a dust bowl. People are going through droughts. Farming has been decimated. All around Alicante there on the east coast of Spain, all the olive farmers are out of business. They had to start planting almond trees. They're absolutely been decimated over there. So the government's wants to be able to do something about the old climate change. So I'll tell you what, right, we're going to give you a few, if you're producing electricity, we're going to give you a few years to bed it down, but you better start investing in eco-energy, wind turbines, waves, solar, the whole lot, because we're going to put a 6% tax on oil and gas electricity production. Oh, you can't have that. The government introducing a mandate that was given them by the people in an election in a democracy. What business has the government interfering in the private business of a private business? That's not on. That's the objective of TTIP, is to end the business of governments interfering in the private business of private businesses. The Spanish government was threatened with being sued for thousands of millions of euro for interfering in the profits of private electricity companies, and it dropped it like a hot potato. And that's what we're looking at. This isn't business as usual. God knows I drink my coffee every morning and I love my banana at 11 o'clock. I'm for trade the same as the next lad. But I'm also for democracy. And I'm also for high standards and high regulations. And I'm against these trade deals. And I've been following them since 1997. And I gave a submission to the Oireachtas Joint Committee on European Affairs back in 2008. And I said, if the Lisbon Treaty comes in, we're going to have a trade deal that's like this, and this. And here it is. You know? I made, at the time of the Nice Treaty and the time of the Lisbon Treaty, I gave talks all over universities in Ireland, and sure, like, no one had listened to me. Bit of a geek. What's this lad going on about?
We'll have to leave it there, Mr. Finnegan. We've
so anyway, I'd appeal. Anyway.
Okay. Well, I'd like to thank everybody for coming here today to engage with the committee. I think you'll agree it's been a really interesting and informative session. Several other groups are invited to submit written presentations, and the ones that we did receive were circulated to the committee as well. So the meeting will now be suspended, and when we resume, we will resume in private session. Is this agreed, members? Great. Thank you. We are now in public session. Item number 8 on the agenda, EU Scrutiny, Schedule A, COM 2015-634, proposal for a directive of the European Parliament and of the Council on certain aspects concerning contracts for the supply of digital content. COM 2015-635, proposal for a directive of the European Parliament and of the Council on certain aspects concerning contracts for the online and other distance sales of goods, text with EEA relevance, SWD 2015-274 final, SWD 2015-275 final. It is proposed that the proposals listed in Schedule A warrant further scrutiny. Is this agreed?
Agreed.
Agreed. Schedule B, COM 2015-616, COM 2015-622, COM 2015-653, COM 2015-654, EWN 2015-C392-14, EWN 2015-C405-8. It's proposed that the proposals listed in Schedule B do not warrant further scrutiny. Is this agreed?
Agreed.
Agreed. And that concludes all of our business on today's agenda. Members are reminded that the report on the all-island economy will be launched on Thursday morning in the AV room at 9:30, and we will have an informal meeting with the Committee on Enterprise, Trade and Investment. Northern Ireland will take place in Committee Room 4 at 11, and the Joint Committee is now adjourned sine die.